I'm fascinated by history, and I'm fascinated by the history of America, and also the history of the city.
I literally knew nothing about this world and how significant and important it is in our history, and it's in none of the history books that I ever read as a young man.
So many aspects of the city's history that I didn't know about, nobody knew about. The great revelation was reading Herbert Asbury's Gangs of New York. Nobody had heard of the draft riots that I knew of. A major event in the city's history, certainly one of the biggest riots in American history, and apparently shoved under the rug. Manhattan was urban up to maybe somewhere in the 40s, maybe the 50s. And then north of that, you have farmland. Down below, you have the rich concentrated right in the middle of the city, along Fifth Avenue, because money went north and it went inland, as far from the waterfront as possible, because the waterfront was dangerous and smelly and all that kind of stuff. The immigrants, which were Irish and German, were toward the east. The Irish south, the Germans north. The Germans were always more settled and more prosperous than the Irish. What the city looked like was brick buildings, generally for the rich, townhouses. The poor mostly lived in frame houses, rather tumble-down frame houses, some of which were pretty old. And they got kind of added on to endlessly. And barns and stables became converted for human use, and humans were living side by side with animals. Animals were running around the streets in the third and fourth decades of the 19th century because of the famine in Ireland. The Irish came in huge numbers. They fled Ireland in droves. And why did they come to New York? Well, they went just about everywhere, but New York was the biggest and most available and closest port. If you draw a straight line west from Ireland, it's New York and Boston were the easiest places to reach.
I think that first great influx of immigration from Ireland was the first great test of what America's supposed to be. This bring us your homeless and your poverty-stricken and those who are oppressed, et cetera, come to our country and become a citizen and work with us. But there were so many, so fast, and for such a prolonged period of time that it created that who has the right to be here situation, which is something that we deal with every day, I think, in America.
They said there were more Irish during that point in history than there were in America than there were in all of Ireland. They were basically perceived as the lowest of the low. You've got to see the caricatures of how they portrayed Irish people, almost like these beasts that couldn't even speak. They were constantly drunk and mindless.
One of the reasons they reacted against the Irish, of course, was that they didn't speak English, didn't have trades, for the most part. I'm just generalizing now. But most importantly, they were Catholic. This is a period of time where they're still fighting to preserve a country that had the separation of church and state.
That's the building of our country right there, Mr. Cutting. Americans are burning.
I don't see no Americans. I see trespassers, Irish hops. What have they done? Name one thing they've contributed.
Votes.
Votes, you say? They vote how the Archbishop tells them, and who tells the Archbishop? Their king in the pointy hat, what sits on his throne in Rome.
He's got mixed feelings as regards the Irish.
The racism of the time was astounding, and don't forget, we're dealing with the Civil War, too.
The rivalries had a lot to do with ethnic identity. These native gangs were identified with the Bowery, and the Irish gangs were further east into the Five Points. And neighborhood turf was absolutely everything to the gang members. And I think probably a good guess for the average age of a gang member was probably about 16 or 17, probably down to as low as 12.
I mean, they did every possible thing that you could do.
Yeah.
At the time, the corruption was unbelievable when you really get into the history of it.
But people must be made to understand that all these things are best kept within what I like to call the Tammany family, which is why I'm talking about an alliance between our two great organizations.
You're talking about muscle work.
That too. Muscle to match our spirit.
You own the crushers, get them to do it.
The police? Oh no, Jesus, no. The appearance of the law must be upheld, especially while it's being broken.
It was a time when the line between criminal and hero and decent human being and not so decent human being were very muddy and murky.
Violence has always been a part of all urban settings everywhere. In particular, if they were port cities, which New York emphatically was. Violence is part of the fabric of New York, has been from the very beginning, and you can translate this to any port in the world.
You have to remember the country had sort of come into being around 1789, I think, and It was now 1860, and the place was being torn apart by war. So, in effect, it was still being tested as a country and still being formed as a country. And there are other issues with the politics, because a lot of it's very corrupt, personified by William Tweed character, who later became the famous Boss Tweed, who is the name now. Whenever they mention corruption in America, everybody knows Boss Tweed.
He was really the most corrupt politician ever, really. I mean, he was ripping off hundreds of millions of dollars, literally, even then. Just ruthless. He set the pattern for corrupt politicians, I think. That man was right born for this.
He's killed 44 men, laid low a couple hundred more.
Is that right?
That's right.
I should have run him for mayor.
Boss Tweed, William Marcy Tweed, was himself of Irish stock and grew up in an East Side tenement. Came up through the ranks and was in one of the leading lights, if not the leading light, of Tammany Hall. He pulled the strings. He controlled the gangs to the degree that the gangs were an unofficial arm of enforcement. The gangs were not officially on the city payroll, but certainly some of the gangs functioned as if they effectively were on the city payroll. And they worked for whoever happened to be wielding the most power. That's how gangs operate. You know, besides protecting themselves and their turf, they are available for hire to whoever holds the club. And since Tweed did, he effectively controlled the gangs.
Every day I go down to the waterfront with hot soup for the Irish as they come ashore. Part of building a political base.
I've noticed you there. You may have noticed me.
Indeed I have, throwing torrents of pavers and withering abuse on every single person who steps off those boats.
If only I had the guns, Mr. Tweed, I'd shoot each and every one of them before they set foot on American soil.
Bill the Butcher was a butcher and a brawler and a gang member. He ran a fire company, the Red Rover. There was not one centralized fire department at the time. It was a collection of voluntary companies. Gangs would have a link to a fire company. A fire company would kind of own gangs, etc. And there were, at any given point, up to maybe 30 or 40 of these companies. One detail you see in the movie is the man sitting on the barrel covering the fire hydrant to hide it from the rival companies. Yes, rival companies would have fights over who got to put out the building, and there was obviously looting involved. There was a financial interest.
Boys, forget that one. Next building over. Mustn't let it spread. Take what you want from that one.
What are you doing? What are you doing? There's nothing wrong with this one. This is my house.
The state set up the Metropolitan Police Force. And for a while, you had these two competing police departments fighting each other, releasing each other's prisoners. The city was chaos. Criminals operated with absolute impunity because they knew that if they were arrested by one set of cops, the other set of cops would set them free. So it was just anarchy.
The fight's over.
Didn't anybody pay off the goddamn police?
We paid the municipal police. This is the Metropolitan Police.
We're looking at the events of that time and place through several distorting lenses. You cannot trust the press of the 19th century on any of these things. Newspapers might have reported deaths because they wanted to make some editorial color. That doesn't mean people actually died. They were sort of impervious to libel suits, so they'd just dispense a lot of scandal. And they were the ones that gave out a lot of the crime stories, but they were often very circumspect. So they could tell you it happened such and such a street, but to a gentleman and a lady, but they wouldn't tell you the names and wouldn't tell you the date because they didn't really know and they might have made it up.
A fresh outrage in the 5 points. It's a notice you can be proud of.
There was something like 20 daily newspapers in New York. The New York Times was not, the famous newspaper of record we think of it as being now. There was one of many daily newspapers. You have a lot of kind of fly-by-night little sheets that came out more regularly, that might only live for a couple of months.
They could have left that ship with nothing. Instead, they made the Police Gazette, a periodical of note.
Police Gazette just increased in importance. It's already fairly important by the 1860s, but gets hugely important toward the latter half of the 19th century, which was the kind of sporting men's sheet. It was the one that would tell you about boxing, would tell you about politics, It would tell you about plays, especially plays in which young women wore body stockings. And this was read not only in New York City, but eventually in every barbershop in the United States. And so a lot of this Bowery culture was broadcast and made famous around the country by the Police Gazette.
What happens at the finish then?
Then we have ourselves a rowdy down. Ain't you never been to the theater before?
Nah.
The people of the 5 Points went to the theater where they saw melodramas. Generally, melodramas were very big. Shakespeare, Shakespeare was eternal, and it was a kind of maybe slowly, action-packed, dumbed-down Shakespeare, but it was Shakespeare. Violence has always been a big draw. Various animals were baited for sport. There were, of course, Kit Burns' rat pit, but there were a lot of institutions like it. Bear baiting pits. There were cockfights. There were illegal boxing matches between humans. They drank, they danced, they sang. People sang much more in the past than they do today. I mean, that is just regular people singing, singing for and with each other. Lots of street musicians, hurdy-gurdy players, organ grinders with monkeys. The minstrel show began in New York City right around this time, actually. In the 1850s is when Dan Emmett and his company started in a hotel downtown, and he's responsible for the song Dixie. So think of that. The song Dixie, so important in the Civil War, comes from New York City.
It was like everything we knew was mightily swept away. And no matter what they did to build this city up again, for the rest of time, it would be like no one even knew he was ever here.
New Yorkers tend to not to know about this stuff for a couple of reasons, really. I mean, there's some obvious ones. There's, American historical amnesia. Everybody knows about that. Documentary photography was unknown. I mean, pretty much. Photographers made their money by taking portraits of the rich and famous. They were not going to risk their equipment by taking them into the poor quarters. And then there's a kind of civic protectionism where you want to talk about the nice stuff. You want to talk about the Vanderbilts, but you don't want to talk about the poor people and their fights. Gangs of New York connects to the history of New York played out in Mr. Scorsese's movies in ways that are, very clear. What we're seeing is the ancestry of the kind of street culture you see in Mean Streets, and the street culture that informs Raging Bull, and the whole panoramic mafia story of Goodfellas. He's obviously fascinated by the social fabric, what holds it together, how it operates in the world, how, how connected people in apparently disparate segments of society are truly, and how life, how history is made by the semi-accidental workings of people in all these different levels.